Chapter 1. The Quiet Before the Fall. The village of Little Tansy prided itself on being precisely the sort of place where nothing ever happened. Or, if it did, it happened with such delicacy that it could be tucked away behind lace curtains and forgotten by tea-time. Nestled among the soft green hills of southern England, Little Tansy boasted a quaint post office, 2 rival churches, and a public house, the Crooked Swan, known more for its gossip than its ale. Miss Jane Marple, spinster of St. Mary Mead, and keen observer of the frailties of human nature, was visiting her old school friend Mrs. Caroline Weatherby for a fortnight. It was one of those indulgent, meandering holidays, filled with quiet afternoons by the fire, embroidery circles, and gentle conversations about everyone else's business, though never their own, of course. On that particular morning, the village was abuzz with excitement over the Tansy Bridge summer fete. Bunting had been strung between the trees. The Women's Institute had produced an alarming number of cakes and preserves, and the local brass band was laboriously tuning their instruments on the green. Even the vicar, Mr. Leonard Denholm, was to give a blessing before the villagers, dressed in their best, paraded across the stone-arched Tansy Bridge, a tradition dating back to some imagined medieval past. Miss Marple, an early riser by habit, took her morning constitutional along the winding lane that led from Rose Cottage to the green. The summer air was crisp with the scent of new hay and wild roses. She paused now and then to admire the gardens, the orderly rows of Mrs. Carter's snapdragons, the riotous tangle of honeysuckle spilling from the Hodges trellis. By the time she returned to Mrs. Weatherby's cosy sitting-room, breakfast was laid, boiled eggs, warm scones, and strong tea. "It'll be quite a day, Jane," said Mrs. Weatherby, peering over her spectacles at the village newsletter. "Mr. Humbleby's to judge the cake competition, and there's a bonnet parade. Ivy Fletcher's to be crowned Rose Queen. Poor child, she'll be tongue-tied as usual." Miss Marple smiled gently and stirred her tea. Ivy Fletcher, such a sweet, shy girl. I recall seeing her at Evensong last Sunday. Mrs. Weatherby nodded. She lives with her aunt now, ever since her father passed. Mrs. Arbuthnot, a rather strict woman, some say too strict, though of course one mustn't listen to idle gossip. Miss Marple allowed herself a small knowing glance at her friend. "And yet one does," she said lightly. Before Mrs. Weatherby could retort, there came a sharp knock at the door. Moments later, their housemaid Elsie appeared in the doorway, wide-eyed and breathless. "Beg pardon, ma'am, but there's been a terrible thing down by Tansy Bridge." Weatherby rose so quickly her chair scraped the floor. "What on earth do you mean, girl?" Elsie twisted her apron between her fingers. "Mr. Humbleby, ma'am, the solicitor from Market Crouch. They say he's fallen from the bridge. Dead, ma'am." Mrs. Weatherby's hand flew to her mouth. Miss Marple, calm as ever, placed her teacup neatly on its saucer and rose. "I think we should go and see for ourselves, Caroline," she said. The path to Tansy Bridge was already crowded with villagers. Miss Pettigrew from the post office, still in his apron, Miss Larkins, the music teacher, and a clutch of children darting excitedly from group to group. The bunting hung limp across the bridge in the still, humid air. Miss Marple and Mrs. Weatherby made their way to the forefront, where a heavy silence had settled. There, lying awkwardly across the wooden planks of the bridge, was Mr. Humbleby. He was a portly man in a good grey summer suit, the knees torn and muddied, his left hand curled unnaturally under his body. His face, normally so ruddy and jovial, was pale, the mouth slack. One shoe had come loose, dangling from his foot. His straw boater hat floated gently in the current beneath the bridge, spinning lazily in place. Dr. Enid Fosdick, the village's capable and unsentimental lady doctor, crouched beside the body. After a brief examination, she straightened, dusting her hands. "Neck broken," she said in clipped tones. "Death instantaneous." There was a communal sigh, half relief, half horror. Constable Graves, young and slightly harried in appearance, cleared his throat. "Move along now, please. Let's give the doctor room. Nothing to be done." But Miss Marple remained where she was, seemingly forgotten in the flurry of movement. Her sharp eyes missed nothing. The faint skid marks along the worn timber where shoes had slipped or been pushed, the broken fastening on Mr. Humbleby's watch chain, the scuffed heel of his shoe, as if he had struggled before falling. She noted, too, the way young Ivy Fletcher clutched her bouquet of roses so tightly that petals were crushed against her white gloves. Standing stiffly beside her was Mrs. Arbuthnot, face set like iron. Close by Mr. Edward Blount, the churchwarden and a man of some self-importance, whispered furiously to Mr. Pettigrew, glancing now and then toward the bridge. "Terrible accident," said Mrs. Weatherby beside her, her voice shaking slightly. "Terrible, imagine, to slip like that in front of everyone." "Indeed," murmured Miss Marple. But in her experience, men did not usually fall to their deaths by accident during fêtes. They fell because someone else had willed it. Later that afternoon, the village green was subdued, the fête proceedings suspended indefinitely. Children kicked listlessly at their hoops, and the brass band packed away their instruments with long faces. Miss Marple sat under a striped awning with Mrs. Weatherby, sipping tepid lemonade and listening. "There was moss on the bridge, you know," said Mrs. Carter, nodding sagely. "Deadly stuff when damp." "And poor Mr. Humbleby wasn't exactly nimble, was he?" added Mrs. Price, the grocer's wife. "But he wasn't that clumsy," said Miss Larkins sharply. "I saw him only an hour before, walking as steady as you please." "Maybe he had a turn," said someone else. "A dizzy spell? A stroke?" Miss Marple folded her hands neatly in her lap and said nothing. She merely watched, the way Mrs. Arbuthnot kept a possessive hand on Ivy Fletcher's shoulder, the way Mr. Blount dabbed at his brow with a handkerchief, his face redder than the sun could account for. Accidents, Miss Marple thought, were curious things. Real accidents rarely happened when they would cause maximum inconvenience to the greatest number of people. No, real accidents were private affairs. A fall from a ladder in an empty garden, a slip on an icy step at dawn. But a prominent solicitor tumbling from a bridge at the heart of the village fête? That, Miss Marple thought, had the distinct smell of murder, and murder, she knew, was rarely committed without reason. Already, patterns were beginning to form in her mind, as naturally as frost patterns formed on a winter pane. Small signs, small betrayals of human nature, weaving themselves into a shape not yet clear, but inevitable. She reached for her knitting with an air of gentle innocence. Let the villagers gossip, she thought. Let the constable fumble, and the gentry wring their hands. She would listen and watch and wait. until the murderer, confident and careless, gave themselves away, as they always did. Chapter 2. Whispers over teacups by the following morning. The death of Mr. Humbleby had woven itself into every breath and corner of little Tansy. News travelled faster in villages than anywhere else, faster than the post, faster even than the telephone at the post office, and by breakfast time the entire district was humming with speculation. Mrs. Weatherby returned from her early marketing, flushed and breathless. "Well, Jane," she announced, setting her basket heavily upon the hall table, "it seems the village has already solved the matter." Miss Marple, seated by the window with her embroidery, glanced up mildly. "Oh, that is gratifying. Perhaps you will tell me who is to be arrested." Mrs. Weatherby gave a short laugh. "Not arrested, my dear. It was an accident, everyone agrees. The moss on the bridge, Mr. Humbleby's stoutness, perhaps a dizzy spell after all that excitement. Poor man." Miss Marple nodded, threading her needle with careful precision. "And yet," she said thoughtfully, "there was remarkably little moss near the spot where he fell. I noticed it myself." Mrs. Weatherby's brow furrowed, but she said nothing, busying herself with unpacking a loaf of bread and a paper packet of tea. "But there's talk," she continued after a moment, lowering her voice as if the walls might listen, "about young Ivy Fletcher." Miss Marple lifted her head slightly, the click of her needle pausing. "Ivy?" Mrs. Weatherby nodded, pleased to share something more substantial. "Some say she was seen arguing with Mr. Humbleby the night before the fete, outside the post office. Quite a to-do, apparently. Raised voices." Miss Marple said nothing, though a small frown knitted itself between her brows. "Ivy Fletcher hardly strikes one as the argumentative type," she murmured. Mrs. Weatherby hesitated. "There's more, Jane. It's said Mr. Humbleby was, how shall I put it delicately, pressing Ivy regarding a certain matter." Miss Marple folded her embroidery neatly on her lap. "Indeed? Oh, nothing improper, you understand," Mrs. Weatherby said hastily. "But he was trustee of the little inheritance left to her by her father. It seems Ivy wished to withdraw some of it to pursue a course in London, secretarial work or something of that sort. Mr. Humbleby refused, said it must be preserved until she came of age or married. A prudent decision, no doubt," Miss Marple said, but her eyes were keen. Mrs. Weatherby sniffed. "Perhaps, but you know how young people are. Always in such a desperate hurry to begin life. And poor Ivy tied hand and foot to that dragon of an aunt." She leaned in closer, lowering her voice. "Some even say Mrs. Arbuthnot opposed Ivy's plans for her own reasons." And what reasons might those be?" Miss Marple asked gently. Mrs. Weatherby hesitated, relishing the moment. "It's whispered," she said at last, "that Mrs. Arbuthnot stands to benefit if Ivy remains unmarried. She controls the money until Ivy's 21. Perhaps she feared losing her little source of income." Miss Marple said nothing, merely smoothing a non-existent wrinkle from her skirts. Money, she reflected, was often at the root of unpleasantness. As reliable a motive as jealousy or pride. Later, that morning, Miss Marple and Mrs. Weatherby made their way to the churchyard under pretence of visiting the rose-beds, but in reality to listen. Villages were like patchwork quilts, Miss Marple often thought. Each conversation, each whisper, a neat little square stitched into the whole. At the lych gate they encountered Dr. Fosdick, her arms full of petitions for the new parish clinic. "Dean, suppose Constable Graves will be calling for an inquest," she said briskly. "Can't have a death on public grounds without one, though it's an open and shut matter if ever I saw one." "An unfortunate accident," Mrs. Weatherby agreed. Dr. Fosdick sniffed. "Accidents don't break a man's pocket watch," she said, adjusting her papers, "nor tear his jacket at the shoulder seam. But that's none of my business." She strode away toward the vicarage, leaving Miss Marple and Mrs. Weatherby to exchange a meaningful glance. It was, Miss Marple thought, exceedingly curious that a fall should leave such curious marks. She tucked the thought away carefully, like a scrap of lace saved for later use. At the post office, Mr. Pettigrew and Mr. Blount were deep in conversation over the counter. "Always said that Bridge was a menace," Mr. Blount was saying, his face red and animated. "Should have been reinforced years ago. Village funds won't allow it," Mr. Pettigrew replied sourly. "Not with the vicar's pet project draining the coffers." Blount snorted. "Foolishness, all that money spent on flower festivals and hymn books when the basic infrastructure is crumbling." "Well," said Pettigrew with a sly look, "perhaps things will be reconsidered now." They laughed, a brittle, uneasy sound. Métit's Marple, seemingly absorbed in selecting a packet of note cards, stored their words away. Mr. Blount, after all, had campaigned unsuccessfully last year for the position of churchwarden. He had long nursed a grievance against the village council, and Mr. Humbleby had been its legal adviser. Old resentments, Miss Marple thought, were like dormant seeds. Given the right soil, they could sprout again. The afternoon wore on, heavy with the promise of rain. At tea, Mrs. Weatherby was joined by Mrs. Parker and Miss Larkins, both bearing tightly corseted expressions and an appetite for scandal. "It's clear as day," said Mrs. Parker, slicing her scone with almost violent precision. "Ivy must have panicked after the argument. Young tempers, you know, probably pushed him by accident." Miss Larkins shook her head. No, it's Mrs. Arbuthnot one ought to look at. A hard woman, she would do anything to keep that money." Miss Marple listened, pouring the tea, smiling faintly at the ironies of human nature. Already the village was cleaving into camps, some siding with Ivy, some whispering of the aunt's supposed greed. Others muttered darkly about the council's mismanagement, or hinted that perhaps Mr. Humbleby had made more enemies than a respectable solicitor should. And yet, Miss Marple reflected, no one had yet asked the simplest of questions. Why had Mr. Humbleby been on the bridge at all that morning, ahead of the scheduled procession? He was an orderly man, not given to early arrivals or changes in plan. It was a small thing, and therefore perhaps a very large thing indeed. That evening, as the sunset painted the sky in molten gold behind the old church spire, Miss Marple sat by the fire, her knitting needles clicking softly. She thought of Ivy's crushed bouquet, the scuff on the bridge railing, the hint of bitterness in Mr. Blount's voice, the calculated coldness in Mrs. Arbuthnot's eyes, and she thought, too, of the roses in Mrs. Carter's garden, lovely, sweet-smelling things, yet treacherous to the unwary hand. Human nature, Miss Marple knew, was very much the same. There was something rotten beneath little Tansy's pleasant surface, And soon, very soon, she would find it. Chapter 3. Early Investigation. By the next morning, an official air had descended upon little Tansy, though it must be said it sat uneasily upon the village's narrow lanes and cottage gardens. Inspector Crayford had arrived from Market Crouch, summoned by Constable Graves' urgent, if slightly muddled, report. He was a tall, stolid man, whose thick moustache twitched irritably whenever he encountered anything that did not conform to his notion of orderly crime, and little Tansy, with its whirring gossip and contradictory witnesses, provided no such order. Miss Marple, ever courteous and seemingly harmless, made a point of passing by the green shortly after breakfast, where Inspector Crayford had set up a sort of makeshift headquarters in the parish hall. Through the open windows floated snippets of conversation. One simply slipped, came Mr. Pettigrew's earnest tones. "Quarrel with the girl," muttered another voice, half muffled. "No proof of foul play," Constable Graves was saying, with what sounded like a hopeful note. Miss Marple smiled faintly, to herself. It was always thus. People rushed to reassure themselves with the most convenient explanation, even when their instincts told them otherwise. She continued her slow walk toward Tansy Bridge. The scene had been tidied. The bunting removed, the muddied planks scrubbed, the roses restrung along the railings. Only a faint discoloration near the centre marked the spot where Mr. Humbleby had fallen. Standing alone by the railing was Ivy Fletcher. She was dressed in simple mourning black, her fair hair plaited neatly, her gloved hands resting lightly on the wood. She seemed unaware of Miss Marple's approach until the older woman spoke. "A sad business, my dear," Miss Marple said gently. Ivy turned, startled, her young face pale and pinched. "Yes, Miss Marple, terrible." Her voice was little more than a whisper. Miss Marple rested her hand lightly on the girl's arm. "You were very fond of Mr. Humbleby, were you not?" Ivy hesitated, then nodded. "He was always kind to me, treated me like a person, not a burden." There was a bitterness in her tone that belied her years. Miss Marple gave a little murmur of sympathy. "And yet I heard there were disagreements." Ivy flushed scarlet. "I didn't mean to argue," she said fiercely. "I only asked for what was mine. I want to leave, Miss Marple. I want to be something." Her words hung in the soft summer air. "And Mrs. Arbuthnot did not approve," Miss Marple suggested gently. Ivy bit her lip hard, then shook her head. "Aunt Agatha says I have a duty to the family name. She says going to London would only bring scandal." "And Mr. Humbleby agreed with her?" Ivy looked away. "He said I was too young, that I must wait." Her hands tightened on the railing until the knuckles showed white. Miss Marple said nothing further. After a moment, she patted the girl's hand and moved slowly away. There was something troubling about Ivy's stance. Not guilt, Miss Marple thought, but deep resentment. Resentment was a dangerous thing. Left to fester, it could drive a person to desperate acts. But resentment alone did not explain broken watch chains and torn seams. There was more here, something not yet visible. Meanwhile, at the parish hall, Inspector Crayford was conducting interviews with all the brisk authority of a man who found the countryside tiresome, but the paperwork inevitable. Mrs. Arbuthnot sat stiffly before him, her gloved hands folded in her lap. "I can't imagine what more you need to know, Inspector," she said crisply. "The whole village saw what happened. Mr. Humbleby slipped." Crayford consulted his notes. "You were not near the bridge yourself at the time, madam." "Of course not. I was organising the children for the flower procession. And Miss Fletcher, your niece?" Mrs. Arbuthnot's lips thinned. "Ivy was ahead of me. I believe she had gone to meet Mr. Humbleby regarding some trivial matter about her trust fund." "Trivial?" Crayford repeated. "A youthful fancy," Mrs. Arbuthnot said with a faint sniff. "The notion of rushing off to London to become a secretary. Quite unsuitable. I see." Crayford tapped his pencil against his notebook. "And you heard nothing untoward?" "Nothing," said Mrs. Arbuthnot firmly. Yet, as she rose to leave, Crayford noted how she smoothed the folds of her skirt over her knees, a small, almost imperceptible tremor in her fingers. Fear, he thought, or guilt. Later that afternoon, a small discovery caused a fresh ripple through the village. Young Tommy Wicks, an adventurous boy who regarded Constable Graves' caution tape as a suggestion rather than an edict, had been poking about the bushes along the riverbank when he found it. Pocket watch. It was lying half buried in the mud, about 10 yards downstream from the bridge. The watch was cracked and muddy, but when Graves gingerly pried it open, the initials inside were unmistakable. A. H. Arthur Humbleby. Inspector Crayford examined it with a deepening frown. "The chain is broken," he said. "Snagged on the bridge, sir," Graves offered. "Perhaps," said Crayford, but he didn't sound convinced. The break was jagged, rough, as though torn by force, not frayed naturally over time. Crayford closed the watch carefully and slid it into an evidence envelope. Miss Marple, passing discreetly by with her knitting basket, caught the entire scene. She smiled sweetly at Constable Graves, who reddened and nodded clumsily. "An accident, Mrs. Marple," he said. "Just an accident." "Of course, Constable," Miss Marple said, her tone soothing. But as she walked on, her mind was anything but tranquil. A man falling naturally from a bridge would not tear his watch chain so violently, nor have the watch thrown so far from the impact point. No, thought Miss Marple, this was not a simple fall. Someone had laid hands upon Mr. Humbleby that morning. There had been a struggle, brief, brutal, and deadly. The villagers, with their eager explanations and whispered suspicions, were looking at motives. Ivy's anger, Mrs. Arbuthnot's control, Mr. Blount's grievance. But they were not looking closely enough at opportunity, at who had been precisely where, precisely when. Miss Marple adjusted her shawl against the rising breeze. It was time, she thought, to pay a few calls. The sort of gentle, seemingly aimless visits that tended to loosen tongues and stir up forgotten details. The answers, as always, would not lie in dramatic confessions or startling discoveries. They would lie, as they always did in the small things. The careless remark, the overlooked contradiction, the telltale silence where there should have been noise. And Miss Marple, with her knitting needles and her sweet, unthreatening smile, would find them. Of that she had no doubt at all. Chapter 4. First Suspects. By midweek, the polite facade of Little Tansy had begun to crack. Though the flowers still bloomed sweetly in cottage gardens, and the vicar's sermons remained dutifully uplifting. There was a tautness in the air that no hymn or harvest display could conceal. Behind lace curtains, conversations sharpened. Eyes lingered longer than necessary. Every nod in the lane, every murmured greeting in the grocer's shop, carried with it an unspoken question. Who among us did it? Inspector Crayford, for his part, had wasted little time in forming a preliminary conclusion. Ivy Fletcher. It was simple, convenient, and, as far as Crayford was concerned, sufficient. Young, emotional, financially motivated, and last seen, speaking with the deceased. All the elements of a neat, tidy solution. At the parish hall, where the inspector had established a sombre command centre amid the Sunday school drawings and old hymn books, Ivy sat stiffly across from him. "You argued with Mr. Humbleby on the evening before his death," Crayford said, his voice patient but firm. We had words," Ivy admitted, twisting her handkerchief in her lap. "But I didn't harm him." "You wanted money," Crayford continued, leafing through his notes. "He refused." Ivy lifted her chin, her face pale but composed. "I was upset, but I would never—" Her voice faltered. Mrs. Arbuthnot, sitting ramrod straight behind her niece, spoke sharply. "My niece is a foolish child, Inspector, but she is no murderer." Crayford closed his notebook with a soft snap. "Foolishness and desperation make a dangerous brew, madam." Mrs. Arbuthnot's mouth pressed into a thin line of disapproval. Miss Marple, who had quietly insinuated herself into the room under pretext of delivering a basket of scones for the constables, observed everything with gentle, bird-like attentiveness. It was all proceeding exactly as she had anticipated. Miss Marple had seen it too often. The rush to judgment, the desire to close a case neatly, to tie it up with a bow before the messiness of real human nature had time to assert itself. At the Crooked Swan that evening, the village gossips gathered like moths to a flame. It was an unspoken rule of Little Tansy that the public house was a more reliable source of news than the Times or the parish bulletin. Mr. Pettigrew, installed at his usual stool by the fire, shook his head solemnly. "Mark my words, young Ivy's to blame," he said, punctuating his words with a wag of his pipe. "Too headstrong, that one. All these ideas about secretarial schools and careers. Nothing good ever came from a girl leaving. Her home." Mrs. Carter, perched on the edge of a chair, nodded vigorously. "And don't forget," she said, "Mr. Humbleby wasn't just the trustee. He was close friends with her father. Would have looked after that money proper. Old Mr. Josiah Green, who rarely spoke unless thoroughly provoked, ventured a croaky observation. Funny business, though. Funny, him falling just there. Always was a careful man, Humbleby." There was a small, uncomfortable silence. "But accidents happen," Mr. Pettigrew said quickly, as if to banish the disquiet. Miss Marple, sipping a mild sherry nearby, smiled quietly to herself. Indeed, accidents happened, but rarely so conveniently timed, or in so public a setting. Meanwhile, Miss Marple conducted her own quiet investigations. On Thursday afternoon, she paid a call upon Miss Larkins, the music teacher, who had been stationed near the bridge that fateful morning, supervising the junior choir's rehearsal before the fete. "I only turned away for a moment," Miss Larkins said, ringing her, hands over her sewing. "I was fussing with little George Markham's bow tie. He can't abide anything round his neck. Poor child's practically strangled by his own collar." Miss Marple nodded sympathetically. "And when you turned back?" Miss Larkins hesitated. "I saw Ivy standing by the bridge, quite near Mr. Humbleby. They were speaking, or perhaps arguing. I couldn't hear what was said." She bit her lip. "And then Ivy ran off toward the green," Miss Larkins said reluctantly. "And a few minutes later there was a commotion." Miss Marple did not press her. She simply patted Miss Larkins' hand, offered a few benign remarks about the weather, and left, her mind ticking over. It was clear that Ivy had quarrelled with Mr. Humbleby. That much was certain. But there remained one inescapable fact. To argue with someone was not to kill them. And Miss Marple, who had spent a lifetime observing human frailty from behind her knitting needles, knew that true violence, deliberate, fatal violence, rarely came from the young. It came from those with more to lose, more to hide. On her way home, Miss Marple paused by the bridge once more. The sun was low in the sky, casting long shadows across the river. She leaned lightly on her parasol, studying the weathered planks. If one were pushed from the centre of the bridge, she thought, one would likely fall straight into the deepest part of the river. The current swift and strong there. But if one fell or was thrown from near the edge, as Mr. Humbleby had been, the body would not be swept quickly away. It would tumble awkwardly onto the stones, precisely as Mr. Humbleby had done, a clumsy accident or a carefully engineered event, and if it were the latter, who would have had the opportunity? Not just Ivy, Miss Marple thought. Many others had lingered near the bridge that morning. Mrs. Arbuthnot gathering the children, Mr. Blount inspecting the fete preparations. Even Dr. Fosdick, who had arrived suspiciously soon after the fall, medical bag in hand. The net, it seemed, to Miss Marple, was far wider than the inspector allowed. And Ivy, poor, foolish, impulsive Ivy, might well be caught in it, whether guilty or not. That evening, at Rose Cottage, Mrs. Weatherby fussed with the tea-things, her face troubled. Surely you don't think Ivy could have?" she began. Miss Marple smiled gently, threading a new piece of yarn into her knitting. "My dear Caroline," she said, "young people are often rash. But murder, real murder, is a heavy thing. It leaves marks, not always on the body, but on the soul." Mrs. Weatherby shivered. "And you think?" Miss Marple's needles clicked softly. "I think," she said quietly, "that we are looking in the wrong direction entirely." She glanced toward the darkened window, where the silhouette of Tansy Bridge stood outlined against the moonlight. Somewhere behind that pleasant facade, hidden among the tidy hedges and bright flower beds, was the real killer. And Miss Marple intended to find them, no matter how charmingly they smiled. Chapter 5. A Hidden Clue. The next day dawned heavy and humid, the kind of weather that made tempers short and gossip lively. Little Tansy seemed to pulse with unease, though outwardly it remained as picturesque as ever. The gardens still flourished, the sun still glinted on cottage windows, and the postman still rattled along the lanes in his battered bicycle, but beneath it all ran an undercurrent of tension and fear. Miss Marple rose early, dressed neatly in a dove-grey muslin dress, and set about her morning with the air of someone gently stirring a pot just before it begins to boil. After a brief breakfast with Mrs. Weatherby, punctuated by Mrs. Weatherby's anxious speculation over the likelihood of Ivy Fletcher's imminent arrest, Miss Marple set out, ostensibly to visit the vicarage and deliver a jar of strawberry jam. She carried the jar carefully in her basket, though it must be said she was far more interested in the conversation she might overhear than in any culinary goodwill. The vicar's wife, Mrs. Denholm, greeted her at the door, a harried look about. "Come in, Miss Marple, come in. You must forgive the mess. It's been rather a trying week. I quite understand," Miss Marple said soothingly, allowing herself to be led into the vicarage sitting-room, where she was offered tea. As Mrs. Denholm bustled away to fetch a tray, Miss Marple allowed her gaze to roam the room, not idly, but with her usual sharp attentiveness. The room was cluttered but cosy, hymn-books stacked on side tables, embroidery hoops perched precariously on armchairs, a faint scent of lavender polish in the air. In one corner, a stack of fete programmes lay neatly folded. It was while reaching casually for one of these that Miss Marple noticed something odd. Among the neat stacks of hymn-books and bulletins was a small crumpled scrap of paper. Half hidden beneath the corner of a cushion. Miss Marple hesitated only a moment before plucking it free. It was a torn piece of a letter, written in a hurried, bold hand. "Not speak of it. You promised. If you tell them, I shall be ruined. No signature, no address. Just those few desperate, furious lines." Miss Marple tucked the scrap unobtrusively into her glove just as Mrs. Denholm returned, balancing a rattling tea-tray. "Such a tragedy, isn't it?" Mrs. Denholm said, pouring the tea with a trembling hand. "Poor Mr. Humbleby. He was such a support to the parish council. And now, this awful business with Ivy." Miss Marple murmured something appropriately sympathetic. "But between you and me, Miss Marple," Mrs. Denholm continued, lowering her voice, "I can't help but wonder if there isn't more to it." Miss Marple inclined her head encouragingly. "You know," Mrs. Denholm said, "there was some unpleasantness last year, over the repair funds." "The repair funds?" Miss Marple repeated gently. Mrs. Denholm nodded. "Yes, for the bridge and the lich gate. A good sum of money went missing. Not officially, of course, it was all hushed up. But some of us suspected. Mr. Humbleby had been pressing for an investigation." "How very awkward," Miss Marple said mildly. Mrs. Denholm shuddered. "Oh, indeed. One hates to think badly of one's neighbours. But money does strange things to people, doesn't it?" Miss Marple agreed with her most sincerely. And as she sipped her tea, she turned over the scrap of letter hidden in her glove. "You promised. If you tell them, I shall be ruined." Was it connected to the missing funds, or to something else entirely? She thought again of Ivy Fletcher, angry, frustrated, but hardly calculating. No, there was something darker here, something that involved secrets long buried, now clawing their way into the light. After her visit to the vicarage, Miss Marple made a slow, deliberate circuit of the village. At the post office, Mr. Pettigrew looked up from his accounts with a harassed air. "Morning, Miss Marple. Awful business, isn't it?" Miss Marple agreed, and ventured a gentle question. "Has there been much post for Mrs. Arbuthnot or Ivy?" Pettigrew frowned. "Nothing much. A few circulars, though." He hesitated. "Yes," Miss Marple encouraged. "There was a letter for Mrs. Arbuthnot yesterday. From London, I think. Bit of a surprise, that. She doesn't get much outside post." Miss Marple smiled sweetly. "Perhaps a solicitor," she said. "They are forever corresponding." Pettigrew chuckled. "Suppose so. Still, odd timing, what with the death and all." Miss Marple agreed again, and tucked the information carefully away. London. Secrets. Threats. A pattern was beginning to form. Faint, but undeniable. That afternoon Miss Marple made her way to Ivy Fletcher's modest home, where Mrs. Arbuthnot ruled with iron precision. She found Ivy alone in the tiny garden, pulling listlessly at a tangle of bindweed choking the rose bushes. "Good afternoon, my dear," Miss Marple said, seating herself on a nearby bench. Ivy glanced up, her face wary. "I suppose you think I did it too," she said dully. Miss Marple shook her head. "No, my dear, I think you are young and frightened, and that you have been very much alone." Something in her tone, so warm, so understanding, loosened Ivy's taut control. Tears sprang to the girl's eyes. "I didn't mean to argue with him," she whispered. "I only wanted a chance, I thought. If he understood, he might help me." Miss Marple patted her hand. "And what happened, Ivy?" The girl hesitated. "He was kind at first," she said, "but then he said something about obligations, about things I didn't understand. He looked— oh, Miss Marple, he looked afraid." Miss Marple's blue eyes sharpened. "Afraid?" Ivy nodded. "Yes, as if someone had threatened him." She shook her head miserably. "I thought he was angry with me. But now I don't know." Miss Marple sat quietly for a long moment, the warm hum of bees filling the silence. Fear. It kept cropping up again and again. Not rage, not jealousy. Fear. Someone in Little Tansy had feared what Mr. Humbleby might reveal. And had killed to prevent it. The scrap of letter in her glove, the missing repair funds, the London letter Mrs. Arbuthnot had received, all threads in the same dark tapestry. Miss Marple rose, brushing a speck of dust from her skirt. "Thank you, Ivy dear," she said gently. "You've been very brave." And as she walked back toward Rose Cottage, she knew, with the quiet certainty of experience, that the time for listening was almost over. Soon it would be time to act. Chapter 6. Confrontations and Secrets. The weather turned the next day, as though the village itself reflected the shift in mood. Grey clouds pressed low against the hills, and a fine mist clung to the hedgerows. The sunlit charm of Little Tansy was gone, replaced by a cold, wary tension. Inspector Crayford, growing increasingly impatient, called for a second round of interviews. Firmer this time, it was clear to all that he intended to wrap up the matter quickly. Ivy Fletcher remained his favoured culprit. Yet, quietly, beneath the surface, Little Tansy was beginning to whisper differently. Miss Marple, knitting calmly by her window, listened to the latest ripple of gossip with a mind as sharp and clear as a scalpel. It was not only Ivy who had quarrelled with Mr. Humbleby. Others had reasons to fear him as well. And slowly, like water seeping into dry soil, the secrets began to rise. It was Mrs. Carter who provided the first real crack. She encountered Miss Marple at the churchyard gate, where the older woman was ostensibly admiring the late summer blooms. "Terrible thing, Jane," Mrs. Carter said, fussing with the latch of her handbag. "Terrible. I keep thinking, if only I'd said something sooner." Miss Marple, with just the right note of interest, inclined her head. "About Mr. Humbleby?" Mrs. Carter nodded vigorously. "Yes, you see, he found out something about the fete money." Miss Marple's fingers paused briefly on her parasol handle. "Really? I thought the accounts were quite in order." Mrs. Carter leaned closer. "Well, they were made to appear so, weren't they? But Mr. Humbleby, he was clever. He said it didn't add up. Said he intended to bring it before the parish council." "And was anyone particularly anxious about that?" Mrs. Carter hesitated, lowering her voice even further. "Mr. Blount," she said finally. "He was treasurer for the Fete Committee last year, you know, and there were whispers." Miss Marple gave a small, thoughtful nod. Mr. Blount, who had been so vocal about Ivy's supposed guilt, had, it seemed, his own reasons for wanting silence. Money lost, reputations endangered, and Humbleby, with his stubborn sense of duty, threatening to uncover it all. Later that afternoon, the air inside the Crooked Swan was heavy with the scent of damp wool and pipe smoke. Mr. Blount, red-faced and expansive, was loudly holding court at the bar, railing about young people with no respect and the need for firm action. Miss Marple, accompanied by the vicar's housekeeper, Mrs. Porter, sipped a mild shandy and listened carefully. "You mark my words," Mr. Blount was saying, pounding the bar for emphasis. "The sooner they charge that Fletcher girl, the better. No good ever came of women wanting careers. Upsets the natural order." A few villagers muttered agreement, but Miss Marple noticed how others, Mr. Pettigrew, Josiah Green, exchanged uneasy glances. And then, quite without warning, Mr. Pettigrew spoke up. "All very well to talk about natural order," he said, his voice sharp. "But some might say others had more cause to worry about Humbleby than Ivy ever did." Mr. Blount's ruddy face darkened alarmingly. "You mind your tongue, Pettigrew." "Only saying what others think," Mr. Pettigrew muttered into his tankard. Miss Marple watched the little exchange with polite detachment. Fascinating how quickly a village could turn. Alliances frayed, loyalties wavered. The smallest pressure applied in the right place, and fitches began to split wide open. It was not only Ivy who had secrets to keep, far from it. By early evening, another tremor rocked the village. Mrs. Weatherby returned from her rounds, breathless and eager, plopping herself into the drawing-room armchair with a dramatic sigh. "You'll never guess, Jane," she said, waving her gloves in excitement. "Mrs. Arbuthnot, Agatha Arbuthnot, was seen this morning, visiting the solicitor's office in Market Crouch." Miss Marple's knitting needles clicked on without pause. "Indeed," she said mildly. Mrs. Weatherby leaned in, dropping her voice to a conspiratorial whisper. Apparently she was in quite a state. Demanding papers. Something about Ivy's trust. Miss Marple allowed herself a small smile. Agatha Arbuthnot, with her rigid insistence on propriety, did not easily lose composure. Yet the threat of an inquiry into Mr. Humbleby's affairs, and the potential exposure of her own involvement in Ivy's inheritance, might well have been enough to crack even her steely nerves. Aunt and niece, trustee and beneficiary. Another tangled web. The final confrontation of the day came in the form of a quiet conversation at the vicarage garden gate. Miss Marple encountered Dr. Fosdick, returning from a visit to a patient on the outskirts of the village. The doctor, normally brusque but good-hearted, looked tired and strained. "Good evening, doctor," Miss Marple said kindly. "Evening, Miss Marple," he made to pass by, but something in her gentle gaze seemed to draw him up short. "You know," he said heavily, "I keep thinking about that morning. About Arthur." Miss Marple said nothing, only nodded encouragingly. "He confided in me, you know," Fosdick went on. "Said he'd discovered something irregular. Something that would upset a lot of people." "About the fete?" Miss Marple prompted softly. "Partly," the doctor admitted. "But not only that. Something about land, Miss Marple. Land sales." Ran a hand through his thinning hair. "I didn't press him for details. Thought it was none of my business. But now—" Miss Marple's eyes sharpened. Land sales. Now that was interesting, because in a village like Little Tansy, land was power, land was future. And if Mr. Humbleby had stumbled across secrets involving property, well, it would not just be reputations at stake, it would be fortunes. That night, Miss Marple sat by her bedroom window, the faint light of the lamp casting long shadows across her knitting basket. The tangled skein of the case was beginning to unravel, but it was still not clear where the thread would lead. Was it greed alone that had driven someone to murder, or something deeper, something older? She thought again of Ivy's stricken face, of Blount's rage, of Agatha Arbuthnot's cold calculation, and somewhere beyond them all, the silent figure of Mr. Humbleby, who had known too much, and paid for it with his life. Miss Marple closed her eyes briefly, thinking. Not much longer now, she promised herself. The killer had sown the seeds of their own destruction, and very soon indeed, they would reap the bitter harvest. Chapter 7. Another twist. The following morning broke with a crispness that was almost jarring after the heavy mists of the previous days. The church bells of Little Tansy rang out across the fields, clear and untroubled, calling the faithful to early service. But the village itself was anything but untroubled. By 9:30, word had spread like wildfire. There had been a second incident. Miss Marple, who had already finished her breakfast and was gathering her hat and gloves, learned of it from young Mary Pratt, the postmistress's niece, who arrived breathless at Rose Cottage's garden gate. "Oh, Miss Marple," Mary gasped, "it's Mr. Blount. He's been found in the woods." Miss Marple set down her gardening shears with a calmness that belied her racing mind. "In the woods?" she repeated gently. Mary nodded furiously, her cheeks pink with excitement and fear. "Yes, by the old well near Kersey Copse. Constable Graves says it looks like he fell. Hurt bad. They're bringing Dr. Fosdick now." Miss Marple thanked the girl and, without fuss, retrieved her walking stick. By the time she reached the green, a small crowd had gathered, buzzing like anxious bees. At the centre of it all, 2 constables were struggling to keep order, while a makeshift stretcher, fashioned hastily from fence rails and an old blanket, was being carried toward the doctor's surgery. Miss Marple caught a brief glimpse of Mr. Blount's face. Grey, slack, his eyes closed, a livid bruise darkening one temple. She turned to Mrs. Carter, who stood wringing her hands beside the pump. "Was he conscious?" Miss Marple asked softly. Mrs. Carter shook her head. "Not when they found him, lying there in the mud like a sack of flour. Poor Mr. Blount." Miss Marple nodded, her face grave. It was, perhaps, not so poor Mr. Blount after all, because if he had merely fallen, well and good. But if someone had pushed him, and Miss Marple strongly suspected they had, then the stakes of this little village tragedy had just been raised considerably. Later that morning, Inspector Crayford held a closed meeting in the parish hall, attended by the few individuals most closely linked to the growing scandal. Miss Marple, through a mixture of innocent persistence and a well-timed remark about assisting Mrs. Denholm with the tea, managed to remain within earshot. Dr. Fosdick, looking exhausted, reported first. "Concussion," he said curtly. "Blount will live, but he's confused. Doesn't remember what happened, or shh, no, and shew, or says he doesn't." Inspector Crayford scowled, too convenient by half. He turned to the assembled villagers. Mrs. Arbuthnot, Ivy Fletcher, Mr. Pettigrew, the vicar, and Miss Larkins. "Let's have the facts," he said. "Last night Mr. Blount left the Crooked Swan about 10 o'clock. Claims he was walking home through Kersey Copse when he fell. No witnesses, no explanation." Mrs. Arbuthnot sniffed. "Very foolish to take that path at night." "Foolish indeed," Crayford said grimly, "especially after what happened to Mr. Humbleby." He let that sink in before continuing. Now, either Mr. Blount truly slipped, or someone meant to silence him. A ripple of unease stirred the small group. Miss Marple, knitting serenely in the corner, observed them all closely. Mrs. Arbuthnot's rigid posture, Ivy Fletcher's tightly clasped hands, Miss Larkins's trembling fingers, the vicar's furrowed brow, and Pettigrew, sly, shifty-eyed, who looked everywhere but at the inspector, very telling, all of it. Outside in the sunshine, the villagers gathered in uneasy clumps, speculating in low voices. "It's all connected, mark my words," muttered Josiah Green to Mr. Pettigrew. "First Humbleby, now Blount. Someone's covering their tracks." Miss Marple, who had wandered over to inspect the late summer dahlias bordering the green, caught the exchange without appearing to listen. She pondered the matter as she plucked a deadhead from a drooping bloom. If Mr. Blount had been attacked, it suggested one of two things. Either he had known something and had been silenced before he could speak, or, and this was the more chilling possibility, he had been involved in the first crime and was now seen as a liability by his accomplice. The thought sent a small, decisive shiver through her. Events were moving quickly now. Whoever had killed Mr. Humbleby, if indeed it had been murder, was becoming desperate. And desperation, Miss Marple knew, made people reckless. At Rose Cottage that afternoon, Mrs. Weatherby bustled in with a basket of scones and a quiver of fresh gossip. "Did you hear, Jane?" she cried. "About the letter?" Miss Marple, arranging her knitting, looked up with polite interest. "What letter, dear?" Mrs. Weatherby glanced around, as though afraid of eavesdroppers. The one Ivy Fletcher received yesterday evening from London. Miss Marple's needles clicked gently. London, you say? Mrs. Weatherby nodded eagerly. She was seen reading it near the green, all flushed and upset. Thrust it into her pocket when she saw anyone coming. Miss Marple tilted her head thoughtfully. And no one knows who sent it. None at all, Mrs. Weatherby said, scandalized. But it's all over the village now. Some say it's from a suitor. Others think... She lowered her voice dramatically. Blackmail! Miss Marple smiled gently. It is curious timing, she agreed. Very curious indeed. A letter from London. A hidden quarrel over money and land. A second attack. The net was tightening, and Miss Marple, serene and sharp-eyed, was drawing ever closer to its centre. That evening, as the village settled uneasily into twilight, Miss Marple sat in her parlour, with a tray of tea cooling by her elbow and the scrap of letter she had found at the vicarage lying beside her knitting basket. If you tell them, I shall be ruined. Who had written it, and to whom? She thought of Mrs. Arbuthnot's visit to the solicitor, of Mr. Blount's furtive glances, of the old quarrels over the fate funds and whispered dealings with land. Secrets had a habit of festering beneath the prettiest surfaces, and soon, very soon, someone would try to strike again, because it was no longer merely a question of guilt, it was a question of survival. Miss Marple leaned back in her chair, her needles clicking steadily in the gathering gloom. Patience, she thought. The truth would come. It always did. Chapter 8. Miss Marple's final test-it was late afternoon when Miss Marple set her quiet plan into motion. The day had cleared after the morning's mist, leaving the fields around Little Tansy washed in golden light, the hedgerows glittering with raindrops. At the vicarage, Miss Marple approached Reverend Denholm with a modest request. The use of the parish hall for a brief gathering. Nothing formal, she assured him. Merely a community tea, an opportunity to soothe nerves and lift spirits after the recent distressing events. The vicar, who was by nature amenable and slightly flustered by the recent happenings, readily agreed. Invitations were sent out discreetly, not as commands but as gentle expectations. Within hours, the essential players, Mrs. Arbuthnot, Ivy Fletcher, Mr. Pettigrew, Miss Larkins, Josiah Green, and even Dr. Fosdick, had all accepted. Miss Marple, after all, was harmless. A dear old lady, fond of teas and knitting and trifling, village matters. No one saw her coming until it was far too late. At 4 o'clock sharp, the parish hall buzzed with low, uncertain chatter. A table laden with scones, sandwiches, and pots of jam provided a comforting distraction, though few seemed truly hungry. Miss Marple, in a lavender dress and carrying her inevitable knitting bag, welcomed each guest with a smile as innocent as a child's. Inspector Crayford lingered near the back of the hall, his broad frame awkward among the fragile teacups, pretending to examine hymnals, but keeping a careful eye on the proceedings. Miss Marple settled herself comfortably at one end of the long table, knitting in her lap, and began to speak. Lightly, easily, as though remarking upon the weather. Such a sad business, poor Mr. Humbleby, she said. It does make one think, doesn't it, about the little inconvenient things people sometimes know. There was a small stir round the table. Mrs. Arbuthnot stiffened slightly. Mr. Pettigrew coughed into his teacup. Dr. Fosdick's hand trembled as he set down his saucer. Miss Marple continued, her needles flashing in and out of the soft wool. "Of course," she said thoughtfully, "secrets are very much like wounds. Left untreated, they fester. And sometimes—" She gave a gentle, meaningless laugh. "Sometimes they force people into the most regrettable courses of action." There was a brittle silence. Only the steady click-click of her knitting needles filled the room. Miss Marple cast a glance around the gathering. She was looking, not for words could lie, but for gestures. For small betrayals, Mrs. Arbuthnot was studying the floor intently, her hands rigid in her lap. Ivy Fletcher sat frozen, wide-eyed and miserable. Pettigrew was mopping his brow repeatedly. Though the room was cool, Miss Larkins fluttered nervously, her teacup rattling against its saucer. It was Dr. Fosdick, though, who intrigued her most. The good doctor had gone very still, his face pale, his gaze fixed not on Miss Marple, but on the far wall, as if seeing something invisible. Miss Marple's soft voice floated on. "I always think," she said, "that people underestimate how easily a little deception can unravel. One never knows, you see, who might have noticed something." Another silence. Then, quite deliberately, Miss Marple shifted her attention. "I remember," she said mildly, "walking past Kersey Copse not long after the fete. Such a peaceful spot, though odd, isn't it, to see the ground so recently disturbed?" There a ripple. Mrs. Arbuthnot jerked her head up. Pettigrew paled visibly, but it was Dr. Fosdick who spoke, too quickly, too loudly. "Why should that matter?" he demanded. "The fete was over. People wander about. Dogs dig holes. It means nothing." Miss Marple set down her knitting with a serene smile. "My dear doctor," she said sweetly, "I never mentioned digging." Fosdick's mouth opened, and then closed. There was a beat of silence, heavy and telling. Inspector Crayford straightened subtly at the back of the room. Miss Marple rose gracefully, smoothing her skirt. "I think," she said in a voice still as mild as spring rain, "that matters are coming clear at last. Don't you agree?" No one answered, but their faces spoke volumes, especially Dr. Fosdick's, taut with panic, as though the walls were closing in. Miss Marple picked up her knitting once more, her needles clacking peacefully. She had planted her seeds. Now she only had to wait for the guilty conscience to bloom. Later, as dusk fell over little Tansy, and the guests dispersed like guilty shadows, Inspector Crayford approached Miss Marple with a deep frown. "You're certain?" he asked under his breath. Miss Marple smiled up at him, her expression gentle. "Certain, Inspector? No, not quite yet. But human nature, you see, is very reliable. When pushed ever so lightly in the right spot, it reveals itself most obligingly." Rose, gathering her things. "I believe, if you're patient, you'll find your culprit tonight." Crayford looked sceptical, but said nothing. He watched Miss Marple shuffle away down the lane, her slight figure soon lost among the gathering mist, and he wondered, not for the first time, whether the greatest detective England had ever produced wore spectacles and carried a carpet-bag. That night, under the heavy cover of darkness, someone crept from their cottage, unseen, or so they thought, and made their way toward Kersey Copse. toward the old well. Toward the place where, they thought, the final piece of evidence still lay hidden. But someone was already waiting for them. A figure small and prim, knitting bag resting on her lap, sitting quietly on a fallen log, as if she had been there all along. "Good evening," said Miss Marple, gently. "I thought you might come." And the figure caught, cornered, sagged in defeat. The final mask had fallen. The truth at last was within Miss Marple's grasp. Chapter 9. The Reveal. The old well at Kersey Copse was an eerie place by day, but under the shroud of night it was positively menacing. Mist coiled in the hollows like breathing creatures, and the ancient stones gleamed damply in the moonlight. Miss Marple sat quietly, her hands folded neatly in her lap, as the figure she had intercepted at the well, Dr. Fosdick, stood frozen before her, his face pale and stricken. "You shouldn't be here," he rasped. "You have no idea what you're doing." "Oh, but I think I do," Miss Marple said gently. "You came to retrieve something. Evidence you believed might yet betray you." Fosdick clenched his fists. "It was an accident," he burst out. "I never meant for it to happen." Miss Marple remained serene. "Perhaps you might sit down, Doctor. It's such a lovely night for a story." For a moment he hesitated. Then, defeated, he slumped onto a mossy stone. Miss Marple continued, her voice mild. "You see, I have been puzzling over Mr. Humbleby's death. Ivy Fletcher quarrelled with him, yes. But Ivy is hot-tempered, not secretive. Mr. Blount's injury. Well, it was too clumsy, too desperate. And Mrs. Arbuthnot, though proud and selfish, is not capable of violence." She peered at Fosdick kindly, over her spectacles. "But you, Doctor, you had the perfect opportunity. The trust of the village, the knowledge of where Mr. Humbleby would be, and when. And most of all, the motive no one thought to examine closely enough." Fosdick stared at her, breathing hard. Miss Marple's voice softened even further, the trap gently springing closed. "You were invested in the land purchase scheme Mr. Humbleby had uncovered. You stood to lose everything if he made his findings public. Worse still, you had been careless with the fate funds, hoping to replace them once the land deal succeeded. When he started asking questions, well, it was only a matter of time." Fosdick buried his head in his hands. "I tried to reason with him," he muttered, "at the fete, after everyone had gone. I asked him to wait, to let it be." "And he refused," Miss Marple said sadly. The doctor nodded, a broken gesture. "He said he would go to the parish council the very next day, that he had already written a letter to the diocesan board." Miss Marple's eyes sharpened slightly. "The same letter you stole from his pocket after you pushed him." Fosdick flinched. "I didn't mean to kill him. I only pushed." He stumbled, hit his head on the bridge rail. I panicked. I told myself it was an accident, that no one would suspect. "And when Mr. Blount began muttering about secrets, you had to act again," Miss Marple said gently. "He was drunk," Fosdick said, almost pleading, "boasting he knew more than he did. I followed him, tried to scare him into silence. He slipped before I could even touch him. It wasn't planned." Miss Marple allowed a moment of silence to fall between them, as heavy as the mist. Finally, she said very softly, "And yet you came tonight, Doctor. to destroy whatever little piece of evidence might still linger here. Perhaps Humblebee's letter. Perhaps something he dropped when he fell. Fosdick bowed his head. Miss Marple rose slowly, brushing the damp from her skirt. "I do not think," she said almost regretfully, "that the inspector will believe in so many accidents, especially when I tell him about the letter you tried to hide, and the false statements you made about Ivy Fletcher." Fosdick lurched to his feet. "You won't understand," he cried. "I built my life here. I saved lives. I've delivered babies, nursed the dying." "And murdered the innocent," Miss Marple said quietly. For a long moment, the only sound was the wind through the trees. At last, Fosdick sagged. "Do what you must," he said, defeated. "I shall," said Miss Marple. She lifted a small silver whistle from her reticule and blew it, a short, sharp sound that carried eerily through the woods. Within minutes, Inspector Crayford and 2 constables emerged from the shadows. Pistols drawn, they had been waiting, just as Miss Marple had instructed. Later, at the vicarage, as Dr. Fosdick was led away in handcuffs, Inspector Crayford turned to Miss Marple with something approaching awe. "You never cease to amaze me, Miss Marple," he said. "You outplayed us all." Miss Marple blushed faintly. "Not at all, Inspector. It was merely a matter of human nature. People always betray themselves, if you know what signs to watch for." "And the well?" "A guess," Miss Marple admitted modestly. Kersey Copse was the only place secluded enough for a panicked man to hide something. And a well, that is rather a natural hiding place, don't you think? Crayford shook his head in wonder. "And the letter?" Miss Marple smiled. "I believe you will find it, Inspector. And when you do, it will tell the full tale of greed, foolishness, and fear." She gathered up her knitting bag and rose. "Now, if you'll excuse me, I believe I left a sponge cake in the oven." As she walked home through the darkening village, Miss Marple reflected, as she often did after a case, on the frailty of human beings. Such small sins, she thought, a bit of ambition, a dash of fear, a desperate need to preserve pride and standing, and yet they grew like weeds until they choked reason and decency entirely. Poor Dr. Fosdick, she remembered him as a young man, earnest and kind, delivering babies with trembling hands. How far he had strayed from that boy! Miss Marple sighed, the cool evening air stirring the lace at her collar. And little Tansy, dear little Tansy, would heal, of course. It always did, but not without scars. Some things, she knew, could never be entirely buried, not even in a village as charming or as deadly as this. Chapter 10. Aftermath. The village of Little Tansy was a quieter place in the days that followed. There were no more impromptu gatherings at the Crooked Swan, no more whispered speculations over garden gates. Life, as it always did, found a way to resume its slow and steady course. But something indefinable had shifted in the air. The Fate Committee disbanded quietly, their future events indefinitely postponed. The old well at Kersey Copse was boarded up by order of the parish council, a neat wooden plaque declaring it unsafe, and Dr. Fosdick's surgery, once the bustling heart of village health, remained shuttered, its windows blank and unseeing. No one spoke of him much, Only in the privacy of their homes behind drawn curtains did the villagers allow themselves the luxury of wondering aloud how such a thing could have happened, how a man they had trusted, a man who had delivered their children, attended their sick beds, buried their dead, could have harboured such darkness. Miss Marple, for her part, made no speeches and accepted no congratulations. She attended church, as usual, laid fresh flowers at the grave of an old friend, and sipped tea with Mrs. Weatherby without once mentioning the words murder or deception. Yet she observed, with her customary sharpness, the subtle rearrangements of village life. Mrs. Arbuthnot, relieved of her guardianship of Ivy Fletcher, withdrew into a kind of haughty seclusion, emerging only to preside over charity drives, where her authority remained unquestioned. Ivy herself, freed at last from her aunt's stern grip, secured a position as secretary to a solicitor in Market Crouch, a modest beginning, but one that offered independence and a future. Mr. Pettigrew, chastened by his proximity to scandal, became almost courtly in his manners, while Josiah Green, ever the opportunist, took over the maintenance of the Fate accounts, promising strict oversight. It was, Miss Marple reflected, a very human response to calamity. One does not confront evil directly in such villages. One tidies it up, folds it away neatly, and carries on, as if nothing had ever disturbed the placid surface. Only the old vicar, Reverend Denholm, dared voice a deeper truth. He cornered Miss Marple after evensong one Sunday, a puzzled, almost wounded expression on his mild face. "I still don't understand, Miss Marple," he said quietly. "He did so much good, saved so many lives. How could he—" Miss Marple smiled sadly. "My dear Reverend," she said, "virtue and vice are not so far apart as people like to think. A little pride, a little fear, a little weakness, and even the best of men may lose their way." The vicar nodded, though it was clear the answer gave him little comfort. Miss Marple watched him amble back toward the vestry, his shoulders bowed. She stood for a moment longer in the cool evening air, her hands folded lightly over the handle of her parasol. Above her, the bell tower of St. Mildred's rose into the dusky sky, the cracked bell silent now, awaiting the funds for its long-promised restoration. It would be repaired eventually, just as the village would heal. But neither, she thought, would ever be quite the same. Some scars, after all, are invisible, but no less enduring. Back at Rose Cottage, Miss Marple settled into her favourite armchair, a fresh pot of tea at her side, and the latest issue of The Lady open on her lap. Outside, the garden drowsed in the late summer warmth, bees droning lazily among the hollyhocks, a blackbird singing from the yew hedge, a perfect peaceful English afternoon. Yet beneath it all, Miss Marple knew life was as complicated and dangerous as ever. People would continue to quarrel over money, to betray friends for ambition, to hide their mistakes behind fragile masks of respectability, and from time to time someone would make the fatal miscalculation that no one had noticed. Miss Marple smiled to herself, a small wry smile. Human nature, after all, was the most predictable thing in the world. And for those who knew how to watch, how to listen, how to understand, there would always be signs, tiny cracks, fraying threads, a shadow crossing a face at the wrong moment. She poured herself a cup of tea, savouring the delicate scent of bergamot. Outside, a few children's voices rose in laughter as they ran along the lane. Inside, the clock ticked steadily on. Miss Marple picked up her knitting needles and set to work once more, as placid, as sharp-eyed, and as quietly invincible as ever.